We're back with another panel discussion in this course, The Art of Scientific Presenting. This time we're taking a look at how to really engage in a scientific discussion. Just like in the previous lesson, we reached out to a lot of students to get their questions, and this is what they asked most. In this panel, Roger and Sabine will guide you on what they learned from years of presenting on conferences and just interacting with their peers. Listen, take out a notebook, and definitely have a look at the workbook as well for the next learning task that will help you put all of this into practice.
Yeah, maybe that's a good point, right? Start with the simple questions first. You ask a question because you don't understand something, or you would like to know how the presenter feels about something or thinks about something. So it can be any question in that direction. So again, I find it difficult to define a good or a bad question, because at that point, the listener, is listening to this presentation and has certain thoughts about it and wants to dig into these thoughts, or wants to know the opinion of the presenter, and then it can go in any direction, right? So it's not really a good or a bad question as long as it is related to the topic. I would say that would be a good question.
Well, maybe after hearing Roger speak, I would say maybe you can summarize it as saying a good question is a question that encourages scientific discussion.
Yeah, I find this is I get that question quite often, that people that ask me, how do you come up with questions? But I have to admit that when I started off as a junior scientist, the questions came half an hour after the presentation, right? Or so when I had more time to think about it, and then I think, oh, I could have asked this, or I could have asked that, and then just by doing it, rehearsing, just by asking questions all the time, or by trying to get to questions, you shorten that period between coming up with the question and the presentation. So I think it's a matter of practice. Just like, maybe to use an analogy, when I maybe the game memory, when you have to turn the cards. If you play with a 5-year-old who is doing that game every week, you will lose because they are practiced in it, right? And this is exactly the same, right? So if you do it more often, if you try to come up with questions, then it will come more easily to you.
And then now most of the audience will think, like I thought in the beginning, like that's easier said than done.
Yeah.
But yeah, I learned from Roger over the years as well. I think a key element there, and that's sometimes challenging in a conference, is active listening, because you can listen and you can be there and listen to a talk, but active listening, then you're really going to critically think about what the research is saying. And the reason I say it's not always easy is because some topics, of course, naturally appeal more to you, and then you are able to engage a lot better in the topic and then critically think about it in your own perspective. And other topics are a bit further from your own research, and it might be more difficult. But I do agree with Roger that practice makes perfect, but coming up with the first step is by probably starting with a simple question that is related to your own research, or trying to find a connection between the talk and your own experience, and do step by step.
Just going to that microphone or raising your hand to ask that question, if you are in an audience, that already raises your blood pressure enormously, and your heart goes like this if you're doing the first time. But just going over that bridge and really try to do it, that will really help. And then if you are more relaxed, you can also think clearer about the questions you are going to ask.
There's a difference between training in the arts of asking insightful questions and training in getting the nerves to ask questions. So, well, to answer from a Maastricht University perspective, I think we try to encourage students as much as possible, because PBL, problem-based learning sessions, they are encouraged to ask questions to one another. But also they have group projects or even presentations. And so every course they have to present something, and the students are encouraged to ask questions. So to sum up, they get a lot of opportunities to ask questions. So that's getting the nerves to do so. Asking insightful questions, I don't know. I mean, you can give tips there, and maybe Roger can add to it in a minute, but I think that's more in practice and depending on the background knowledge you have, like how critically you formulate a question.
Yeah, I would like to come back to this point that Sabine said about students giving feedback to each other, and the original question about how we can train people. I think that that point that Sabine raised is very important. You can train people if you put them in a safe environment, right? So it is safe to ask a question and not being sure whether it's a question with enough depth, or maybe it's you think it's a stupid question, right? So giving them a safe environment in which they can ask questions and giving feedback about that, and then you make it more complex all the way, right? You start off with a safe environment where they feel at ease to ask questions, and then later on you go to bigger audiences, etc., and then you raise that level of confidence where you are willing to go there to the microphone and ask a question even if there are 1,000 people in the audience, right? So I think building up that confidence, I think that would be uh, getting the nerves to ask the questions. And then the insightful questions, I think that also comes with experience. That because you know about study design, you should maybe also be oriented a little bit bigger, broader than just your own research field, so that you can see, okay, how can you apply this to your settings, and then because that's actually what I often do is I if somebody's presenting something, it's not my expertise, it's not, or maybe it's my expertise but not my research, but then putting it on top of my own research and saying, okay, how would I have done it the same way, and if I would have done it differently, then ask that question, why didn't you do it like that, or something like that, right? So what was the choice you made going for this study design, or something like that, right? So if it is not already explained by the presenter, of course. So insightful questions comes with experience, I would say, also.
You need to have some kind of framework, your mental framework, where you have a basis of knowledge, and then you try to connect different compartments, let's say, to formulate a critical question that can lead to a scientific discussion.
I am curious, right? I want to know how the human body works. I'm also interested in how the stars move, and I think that is something that needs to come from the student itself. This curiosity, and then ask questions, and to just go a little bit deeper than what the presenter showed.
Another thing, and it's more technical maybe, is that whenever you're doubting on if your question is going to give you the answers that you're hoping for, think about asking, well, not closed questions, because then you might end up with a yes or no, or yeah, that's a good idea, or thank you. But also not too broad questions, of course, because then it can go everywhere. So you have to find a meet in the middle. So an open question, but directed in a certain way. So I would say specify your question as good as possible, that you get the answer out of it that you want. And of course, you can create some discussions, but often in a conference, time is limited. So then it's important to write a specific, to ask a specific question that gives you a quick answer that you want. So yeah.
Yeah, and maybe indeed, what you made a slip of the tongue in which you said right, but maybe just to get that confidence to go to that microphone and ask, maybe in the beginning you should write down your question and just go there and read it, because then you also don't stumble over your own words. but you have it there and you know exactly what to ask.
Mm.
So that also helps, maybe helping you in getting more confidence to go there and ask that question.
That's a good point. Or people could even practice writing it down if they don't have the courage yet to ask. But if
Yeah.
they at least practice formulating questions, and then maybe they can go up to the presenter during the coffee break, which is more like a safer environment, but then they at least practice making questions and asking them, and maybe then at one point they dare to ask it in the bigger audience. Yeah.
Well, another way to get people acquainted or more confident in asking questions is what I often do with students, right? Bachelor students. I tell them, if person X is going to give a presentation and somebody else needs to ask a question, I would say, ask that question, ask that person who is presenting to give you a question, right? So then you know it's not a stupid question because it's the question made by somebody who is giving the presentation, but you at least step up to the microphone and ask, right? So that gives you maybe a little bit more confidence. It's a little bit of cheating, of course, because you ask a question where the presenter already knows the answer to because he was the one who came up with the question. But it gives you more confidence. And I think that's something that is very important to build up.
I think online, because it's a safer environment, because we've been talking about safe, people usually feel safer behind the screen. And also, if you are in these kind of webinar platforms, you can just type your question. So probably there are people there to ask a question more quickly because they don't have to stand up in a big audience. They not all the eyes are on them. And in a webinar, also their question is read out by the moderator, and then the presenter answers. So that's, I think, an advantage for people daring to ask questions. Of course, for the presenter, it limits the discussion a bit because sometimes when they answer, the person that asked the question might ask a follow-up question and you get some of a discussion. You might not have that then, usually not in an online setting. But it's definitely, I think, for people new in asking questions, it's a safer environment. So.
Another difference between online and on-site is when I get a question for on-site, I see who asks the question. So I look at that person. Whereas online, you don't know who is asking that question often. And then you just talk to the whole audience. And I think that's maybe something that we should also do on site, right? So you explain it to the whole audience and not just to that person who is asking the question. Because that can trigger also the discussion with the group instead of only that individual. I don't deal with that at all. I think that's why we have a chair in each session, and the chair needs to take track of time, and then if the time is done, you have to move on. But then I think it would be good at coffee breaks or whatever to go, if your question is not answered and you really want to have an answer, you go up to that person and ask it during the coffee break or something similar.
What can also happen is that the share needs to come with questions if there's no questions of the audience. And that's sometimes scary for people to share a session. So there the advice is to, for instance, read the abstracts up front of the presenters, so that you already know a bit of a background, and then you can already think ahead of where maybe you want to ask a question about if a question might not come during the presentation. But that's when there's no immediate questions from the audience. So that's the opposite effect. Yeah.
When I am in an audience and I see, for instance, that there is a young student giving a presentation, and the student really made an effort to make a good presentation there and put a lot of effort in there, and then the chair says, "Are there any questions? No questions? Okay, we move on." I feel as that's a pity, right? So you would like to. I always that at that point I always stand up and ask a question because I think it's a little bit of respect towards that presenter as well, to say, okay, hey, I listened to you, and I have a question for you, right? So I think asking questions, especially to young students, it's also part of their development, I would say, as a scientist.
Now, it's funny that you say that, Roger, because I agree with you. I think it's out of respect, and it's always nice to see you do that when you jump in and ask a question. But I sometimes also hear from students like, "Ah, but I don't want questions because then maybe I don't dare to or don't know how to answer them." So that's maybe probably I know I've seen you doing this, and you usually ask a very simple question or not to push them too much. But this is also maybe for the presenters then to learn how to answer questions. It's a way to get the courage to answer questions. So yeah, again, it works in two ways.
If you don't know the answer, I think there's nothing wrong with saying I don't know,
Mhm.
especially if it is not is a question more general, not related to the subject that you answered. Then you can always say, okay, we didn't study this, right? So I don't have an answer here at this particular moment. If it is an answer you should have known, well, yeah, that's too bad, but that's how it is.
Again, having the courage to admit that, because there's nothing worse than trying to go around and around and trying to answer it in a way, but really not knowing what to say, then it is indeed better to say, I don't know, or the answer escapes me at this moment, but I'll come up to you in the break and maybe we can have a further discussion about this. It could be that you didn't understand the question, so that can also be, and then you maybe can ask to reformulate the question so that you understand it better. But yeah, honesty, I think, is the best way, just to admit that you should have known, but it escapes you at the moment, something like that. In an online setting, that then depends on the moderator. The moderator could check which type of questions are in the list, because you get them in this Q&A box. And what I did myself once when I was a moderator, that you try to group questions that are dealing with similar topic. So indeed, online, that's the advantage, because you can see maybe a question comes back more often and you try to combine them in one question, things like that. That's the advantage again of then the online Q&A box. So there you can, yeah, make sure that you pick out the ones that are linked, but also that encourage the discussion. And then if there's still time, then you can still pick, out of respect for the person who did ask, the maybe hindering question, like I'd call them, to still deal with that. But then at least you have had a good discussion already. And it depends also where you're at. If it's at a presentation, I yeah, that's not nice if that's a question. And in an online one, you can skip these. In a real life, I don't know how to skip these hindering questions, because you would rather have a question that tells you, like, yeah, to create a discussion that you can brainstorm together about next steps, let's say future directions to take, while someone had asked you to go back to such and such slide to maybe explain again that one value in the table. Well, maybe the way to deal with that is to answer shortly on that question then, so that there's still time for other questions. But it's harder in real life to avoid these questions. Like Roger said, you kind of, out of respect, have to answer these
But I
anyway.
like, so that would be an advantage of online sessions, right, Sabine, that you can indeed group questions together and
Mhm.
then ask one general question, answering actually all those questions at
Yeah.
once. But on site, that is not possible because, yeah, you just have to deal with the question that comes up at that point. Actually, at the coffee machine or in the breaks, there
That's
you
because
have the.
you drink coffee.
No, yeah, okay, but in general, I think most of the best discussion is around everything, right? Not at the session itself, But in the meetings in between where you talk to people, etc., there you can, because there you are in a less you are in a more open situation, right? So you can discuss things with each other. But whereas in a presentation, after a presentation, you can have a discussion, of course, but usually these discussions are limited in time, right? So you, unless you have, of course, a discussion panel, that is a different story. But if you have a presentation with a few questions, you don't have enough time to go into discussions, scientific discussions in depth, right? So I think the best time is if you really want a deep, in-depth discussion with somebody, don't do that after a presentation, but just go up to that person after the presentation, during the break or whatever, or maybe email that person later on, and discuss it with them separately.
What they sometimes do is that they first have 3 or 4 presentations, and they don't ask questions after every presentation because usually you select them on a certain topic anyway in a session. And then at the end of that topic session, they have more time, like half an hour or maybe even more, for discussion. So they can still, so all the presenters go back to the front, they can still ask individual questions to each presenter, but they can also have a discussion. So the presenters among themselves can interact and the audience can interact. So this is sometimes nicer than just having questions after every presentation.
Right, so that would be for scientific discussions, that would be the ideal situation. But for young students having to come up with questions, it's making it more difficult, because if the presentation was how do you come back to something, right? um, while you're also listening to the other two presentations also, so it's a more challenging situation,
Mm,
I think.
it's more challenging, but they can
Yeah,
write it down.
that's a good point. Yeah. Respect for the other's opinion. If somebody else has a different opinion, does not mean that his or her opinion is wrong, and you should respect that. Although you might disagree, but you have to respect it.
Yeah, what I said before, I think active listening is a key element in order to ask engaging questions, indeed, respect for one another, and not being afraid to put in a controversial comments, because if it is a debate or an open discussion, then you expect that there is this kind of level of respect. So in order to trigger others, you might have a different view and not be afraid to put it out there.
And sometimes also, to be more respectful, if I have a challenging question, I actually say that in front of my question, that hey, I have a challenging question here, or let me play the devil's advocate or something like that, right? So I mentioned that it is a challenging question that might be challenging their beliefs, right? And then you still show the respect that is needed there. I am a biologist by training, but I worked together with people that were chemists. And it sounded like we speak the same language, but actually it wasn't. So I was, for instance, talking about relative detection limits, whereas a chemist is talking about not a relative, but an absolute detection limit. So there are small things that you might encounter that can maybe be difficult in the discussion, because you have a different concept and different words for the same thing. And there you should learn from each other, I think, and be open for listening to the active listening that Sabine said, and say and looking at what actually is this person telling me, right? And be open that it might be slightly in a different context than your own point of view.
Yeah, knowing the background, but this is then again for a panel discussion, but can also be a speaker. Knowing the background of the panel members or the speaker can help both in formulating your questions, but also in how you bring in topics. Because what at least you see more and more in the conferences that we organize in Europe is that the audience is very diverse. There's academics, there's people from industry, regulatory bodies, and they all speak a little bit their own dialect, let's say. So, and then it is important, and maybe just to double check, like, did I understand this correctly? And then is this because this is how I interpret it? Is this the way you see it? There's nothing wrong in asking clarifications if you have the feeling you're not on the same line. So.
Yeah, I like the dialect analogy. First, for the presenter, it makes him or her aware of critically thinking about his own results or his or her own results. What I usually did is when I had when I had a manuscript to write, I first presented it to the department because there I got questions that I can use in the paper that I'm writing. Right? So it helps you to critically think about your own work. Whereas for the people that are asking questions, it's actually also for them to get new ideas and for their own studies, right? So how did they do it, and how can I incorporate that knowledge into my papers or my work, right? So it's a two-way street, and that's, I think, very important in these scientific debates.
Again, if it's in a real life situation, but also online, it can be possible. If you ask a question, you get visibility. Some people find that scary, but the good thing about getting visibility is if you want to start collaborations with a person, you are the one that they will remember. They will remember your face, or if it's online, they can see your name and maybe they go and Google who you are. So asking questions also gives you visibility for future collaborations with other scientists.